Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the HSTA's news conference about how the stimulus bill prohibits the state of Hawaii from reducing public education budgets. We're going to hear first from HSTA's president, Corey Rosenlee, and then from former congresswoman, former state senate president, and lawyer and expert on many things, Colleen Hanabusa. So without further ado, we're going to start out with some remarks from Corey, and then after those initial statements, we're going to take some reporter questions. Corey?
Thank you. I'm Corey Rosenlee, president of the Hawaii State Teachers Association, and thank you for attending our news conference today. Congress passed the $900 billion stimulus bill, H.R. 133, in late December. This bill contained $183 million for Hawaii's public schools. But it also has two provisions to make sure the money is used for its intended purpose to educate our keiki. The law was written to avoid the exact situation that occurred in Hawaii, where Governor Ige's planned cuts to the DOE's budget are larger than the proposed cuts to other departments. So when the stimulus money does come in, the governor wants to use that money to balance the overall state budget. Such a move would fail to maintain the stimulus bill's requirements to keep the education budget at pre-COVID levels. In essence, the stimulus bill prohibits the state from cutting the Department of Education's budget. The first provision of the stimulus bill that applies to our situation is Section 317, which says the state has to fund education at the same proportional rate as the state had in the 3 previous fiscal years before COVID-19 hit. Another portion of the bill, Section 315, further says that local education agencies also shall, and I will quote here, to the greatest extent practicable, continue to pay its employees and contractors during the period of any disruption or closures related to coronavirus. Federal law says Hawaii needs to fund education, retain its teachers and other DOE employees, and pay them at least their current rate of salary. HSTA's attorney, Colleen Hanabusa, a former member of Congress, a former state senate president, who has read and analyzed the bill, will explain its provisions and the ramifications in a moment. Currently, the state is not living up to these stimulus provisions. Next school year, the Hawaii Department of Education will take the largest financial hit of any state department, with nearly a $400 million loss. The projection could lead to more than 1,000 teachers and possibly 1,800 school employees in losing their jobs. The Hawaii State Teachers Association is highlighting this issue now so that Governor Ige can make the needed changes to his budget, and the Board of Education and Department of Education will modify their use of the stimulus funding to abide by the stimulus bill's provisions. On Thursday, the Board of Education will vote on the Department of Education's request, detailing how it plans to use the $183 million in stimulus funding. HSTA does not support the DOE's proposed use of $63 million of that total, 1/3 of all the stimulus funding, for private tutors and summer school, while at the same time firing teachers and other school staff. Hiring private tutors is a luxury we cannot afford right now, especially as the state contemplates firing more than 1,000 educators. HSTA will ask that the Board of Education modify the DOE request to follow federal law and to make sure that our keiki have teachers and other staff so important for their well-being. Getting rid of the public schools' big budget gap will require the DOE and BOE to use as much of the $183 million of stimulus bill funds as possible to make up for current cuts. It will also require Governor Ige to modify his budget using the $471 million in additional revenue projected by the Council on Revenues. And we will need the legislature to find additional revenue during the session that starts tomorrow. The stimulus bill reaffirms that educating our keiki, even during a pandemic and a recession, must be paramount. With that, I will turn it over to Colleen Hanabusa, who will explain more about the stimulus bill, HR 133, and its ramifications. Colleen? Colleen, you're muted right now.
Thank you, Corey. And thank you all for listening in on this press conference. You know, it's undisputed that what we are going through because of the novel coronavirus or COVID-19 is unprecedented. And in recent history, no one has ever seen the kinds of ramifications, deaths, and everything that we have had to go through. We also know that the federal government has also reacted to this. Congress has actually passed and the president approved a battery of bills, beginning with March 6th, March 18th, March 27th, and April 24th. The March 27th bill is what is called CARES Act, and I know that many have looked at it. But when we look at the CARES Act bills or this whole situation, of course, people have concentrated on health issues, they've concentrated on the economic issues, but what we have not put enough focus on is the fact that the bills themselves, CARES Act in particular, and the recently enacted on December 27th, what we call the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, what we have not looked at is the fact that these bills have specific provisions in it, such as to the Department of Education. The reason why education is so critical and it's relevant here is the fact that no other department has the provisions in it that we are about to discuss. And also, we will also tell you why the state, the governor, is required to follow this as well. Now, let us know that when the Department of Education bills are concerned in both the CARES Act and in what we call CARES Act 2, which is the Consolidated Act, there is something established called the Education Stabilization Fund. The word stabilization is critical because it is setting forth exactly the intent of these provisions. Now, there is within there 3 separate funds. We call one GEAR, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, ESSER, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Fund, and the third fund is with higher education. But let's concentrate on the first 2. So in order for us to understand how critical the Congress and the president looked upon education, there are 2 provisions in the bill that's not found anywhere else that makes a very clear policy statement. One is section 315 called the Continued Payment to Employees. It reads as follows. A local educational agency, state institution of higher education, or other entity that receive funds provided under the heading Education Stabilization Fund shall, to the greatest extent practicable, those are critical words, greatest extent practicable, continue to pay its employees and contractors during the period of any disruptions or closures related to coronavirus. The second provision, which is also set forth in this, is called the Maintenance of Effort, which is section 317A. And it reads like this. At the time of award of funds to carry out section 312 or 313, by the way, that's GEAR and ESSER, a state shall provide assurance that such state will maintain support for elementary and secondary education and for higher education, which shall include the state funding to institutions of higher education and state need-based financial aid, and shall not include support for capital projects or for research and development or tuitions and fees paid by students in fiscal year 2022, at least at the proportional levels of such state support for elementary and secondary education and for higher education relative to the state's overall spending average over fiscal years 217, 218, and 219. The secretary, this is another section in there, may waive the requirement of what we call the maintenance of effort for the purpose of relieving financial burdens on the state that have experienced a precipitous decline in financial resources. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that we have CARES Act 1, which is the March 2020 enactment. And we have CARES Act 2, which is what we're calling now the December 27th enactment. Now, CARES Act 1 also has these provisions in it. And in CARES Act 1, it is not 315, it is Section 1818006. And Section 317 is Section 18008. Now, what is the significance of all of this? When the governor applies for his GEAR funds or GEER funds, which I have not seen an executed copy by the governor, but my understanding is he received those funds, so he must have executed what is called a certificate of agreement. I have seen Superintendent Kishimoto's execution of her certificate of agreement. What is important is that in both of those certificates, the governor and the superintendent both acknowledge these specific provisions, that they recognize their obligation to ensure, and these are important provisions, continued payment to employees, and of course, the maintenance of effort. So unlike other departments, I believe that we can all share in the objective and goal that what we're talking about here is to ensure that the next generation of leaders, that the keiki, the students, do not fall behind. And that is why there is this requirement that in order to get the stimulus funds or CARES Act funds, the government, Hawaii, the governor and the superintendent had to concur in their certificate of agreement that they're very well aware of these two provisions and their commitment to uphold them. So with that, Corey, I believe that we've touched upon the two provisions and why we believe and why it is, in my opinion, that when the Board of Education looks at adopting this Thursday the position of the Department of Education, it has got to recognize first whether they are in compliance of both Section 315 and 317, and I do not believe that they are.
Thank you so much, Colleen. With that, then, we will take some questions.
Yes, sure. And first, we have Daryl Huff from Hawaii News Now. Why don't you unmute yourself there, Daryl, and have at it.
Yes. First of all, what's the remedy under the law for you to address this? Number two, it seems like the terms proportional rate of spending compared to other departments maybe, and to the greatest extent practicable are both pretty giant loopholes for the state to stand in. How do you overcome that, and what do you do next?
Go ahead, Colleen. Why don't you take the first one on that?
So, Happy New Year, Daryl. So the issue on how do you go about making sure that these provisions are in fact enforced? When they signed the certificate agreement, and this is something that I was rather surprised that they had included in it. They warned both the governor and the superintendent that you can be subject to penalties like the False Claims Act as well as debarment. So they're making it very clear that when you're signing this, you have got to have an understanding of what you're promising to do. As to what do these words mean, you're right. And the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education, did not enact any rules to basically clarify or to make clear what precipitous is, or what, for example, the greatest extent practicable, but they have issued directives that, in fact, like in any other kinds of constitutional statutory interpretation, when there is no other kinds of guidance, you give it the plain meaning of the word. In other words, what does precipitous mean versus just simply a reduction? Or what does the greatest extent practicable mean versus try hard? You know, these are going to be subject that if we don't reach an agreement, and hopefully the governor and the department will see what they have agreed to do and look at it, then, you know, it's going to be subject to some form potentially of litigation or arbitration or something along those lines. But notwithstanding that, you give it its very practical interpretation, and that's what the law says. And also be aware of another fact, which is that when you look at both CARES Act 1 and CARES Act 2, the standard for minimum maintenance of effort on the CARES Act 1 is a same level, which seems to be very clear. It's the same level as the 3 prior years, the same 3 prior years. Now, that's important in that, there was $43 million that the state received back in March or May when they finally signed their agreement. And today, or as of December 31st, do you know the state hasn't used all that money yet? So there's still money available that are going to have to be funded through the same level. And same level seems to be this something that you and I may not disagree on. Having said that, remember, this is an agreement before you receive the ESF funds, the education stabilization funds. You have to agree to do this before you receive those funds. Corey, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just add a couple things, Daryl. To the 2 provisions, the Department of Education disproportionately took a larger hit than other departments of their budget. By sheer amount, they took the largest cut for the state. And just to follow the provisions of that one for 317, they're not following the proportional cut. By our estimates, and this is a preliminary estimate, it's somewhere around the $170 million that the DOE took more than this the stimulus bill would allow. Also, the Department of Education disproportionately has more employees in other parts of the state. So when trying to do furloughs, it also goes against the stimulus bill in this case. So there's multiple provisions. And we're hoping that through this press conference and making people aware that the governor and the BOE and DOE will revisit their budgets and how they use the stimulus funds to abide by the law.
Daryl, do you have a follow-up?
Not right now. I do want to find out what the status is of your other challenges to the furloughs.
Okay, let's get to everybody else here, and then we can come back to that. So next in line is Sivan Lee from Civil Beat.
Hi, Corey. Excuse me. So in the latest budget agenda released by the DOE, they're talking about 1,300 potential teacher cuts. How would the HSTA feel about, these delayed furloughs to mitigate some of the layoffs that are projected to happen if there isn't any other emergency relief coming? What is your position on supplanting these potential cuts with, occasional furlough days?
So following HR 133, we do not believe it has to be a choice between pay cuts or layoffs. Both are bad. And I think, to be clear, what the law is saying is that you need to maintain your positions and you need to maintain pay. And I think that that's what we have to keep as the baseline of what we're advocating for and what our state should be doing. Trying to make sure that we can pay our teachers and make sure that we have teachers in the classrooms is the exact intent of what this law was passed to do, is to make sure that we stabilize education. So I don't think that it has to be a choice between one or the other.
Okay, and next we have Nina Wu from the Star Advertiser.
Hi there, Corey. I just wondered if you could talk some more about the whole idea of using the private tutors. So you are pretty much against the use of any of these outside tutors. Would you be open to then should the public school teachers, existing teachers, be the ones that have that first opportunity then maybe to be these tutors, or to also offer the summer school? Is that what you're saying, or? So
right now, the Department of Education is looking at, just to its base budget, a loss of $264 million. The stimulus bill of $183 million means that we have to make tough choices. Trying to fund $53 million of private tutors while at the same time firing 1,000 teachers makes absolutely no sense. Of course, there's going to be learning loss, but if we lose 1,000 teachers, we know from our past experience that it's really hard to, create a pool of teachers. And if we lose these teachers, it will be years or decades before we can get, catch up. And we're still trying to catch up from the last recession. So what we're saying right now is tutoring, whether it's even private or public, is just a luxury right now we cannot afford. The most important thing is keeping our qualified teachers, starting school as soon as it's safe. And our teachers, I know, and our kids are often resilient. It's going to be a hard job. And that's why it's so important that we maintain our teacher force. And hopefully next year we can go back to face-to-face learning. And it's going to take some work from our teachers to get our students back up to the levels that they need to be at.
Okay, looks like Suvan from Civil Beat has another question. Suvan?
Hi, this is moving on to another piece of the DOE's proposed budget. They talk about also putting in a 30 to 50 million, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact figure right now, from the new stimulus funds from CARES Act to funding the teacher salary differential in its second year of pilot. What are the HSTA's thoughts about continuing that program? And would you at all advocate for withholding that money and funneling it back to weighted student formula or what have you to offset that $100 million deficit to support keeping the teachers in lieu of the differentials?
So right now, the request from the Department of Education to the Board of Education is to pay for this current year's differentials. Unfortunately, there is no proposed funding for next year's differentials, which I can tell you is a travesty in itself. We have seen that the differentials have achieved what we did not think was possible. And we have seen a huge dent into solving the teacher shortage crisis that was created this year through the differentials. We had the lowest amount of vacancies for special education teachers this year. We were able to retain nearly 250 teachers more than we had in previous years. We have seen at colleges people going into education because of the differentials, especially in special education. So it breaks my heart that we finally found a program that works, and we're struggling right now to find the funding for it. I do hope, Suvan, that I do hope that Congress will pass additional stimulus funding. It is significant what President-elect Biden is proposing. And if that money could be used to fund the differentials, it would be, very helpful for our keiki.
Thanks, Suvan. And Daryl, did you have another follow-up? You wanted to ask something else related to?
Yeah, I'm just curious as to what the status of your other appeals are with against the Labor Relations Board and court, right?
So right now, there have been no furloughs imposed right now. So that's on delay because the governor did pull back the first imposing of furloughs. So right now, we're just hoping that it doesn't happen for next year.
Okay, that was the prohibited practice, right? That is then pending to see if that furloughs come down.
Yeah, so I don't know, Colleen, if you feel inclined to help us on this one.
I don't know.
Yours,
yes, but my understanding is that it is sort of in abeyance because the remedy that's been requested isn't necessary at this time because the governor is not imposing his furloughs or cuts. I believe what he said earlier once, because remember his projected budget went down to the legislature just because of the time frame before December 27, 2020. So he had no idea at that time how much would be received in terms of what we call the CARES Act 2, or how much was in addition to what they received in terms of the annual budget. So I think they're in a position now of trying to analyze that, Daryl, and deciding how short are they? Because it's different from what they did before. So what's happening on Thursday is the proposed use of the funds that they anticipate coming down. But I believe that we're talking about two separate matters in terms of that. So that's why I believe that what the Board of Education would do or should do is to pull back any action on the CARES Act 2 funding until they get a better feel for what exactly and how are they complying with 317 and 315, the continued payment plus the maintenance of effort.
Okay, now I'm confused, sorry. I thought so the sustaining of effort and then the sustain of pay, those are in the first CARES Act or they're in the second?
They're in both.
They're in both.
They're in both, Daryl. The difference is in the maintenance of effort for the first CARES Act, which by the way, the DOE has not spent all its money yet. That sounds familiar. In that provision, it's a level funding. You have to keep it level to what happened in fiscal years, basically 217, 218, and 219, not 2020, because it has the coronavirus impact in there. So that's level. The CARES Act 2 changed it to a proportional amount. In other words, they will get a proportional amount of in other words, the secondary education, some elementary and secondary education, K to 12, as they call it, will get the proportional amount in those years. So that's the only difference between what's in one and what is in two.
So Daryl, just to say, we do not have furloughs until June 30th. The governor is proposing furloughs on July 1st, but that's if they cannot get the budget, the funding from the legislature right now. So we are hoping that the legislature will appropriate enough funding to make sure that we can avoid this.
Thanks, Daryl. And
Thank you.
I think Suvan has another question here. Suvan?
Oh, hi. So this is not a budget related question, but if I may ask about the teacher vaccine effort. Corey, what are you hearing about this process right now? Is this going according to plan, according to schedule? You guys put out a notice last week that we would start seeing teacher vaccinations starting at the end of this month. It's already been happening in some places around the state. What are you hearing about sort of the efficiency and the rollout right now?
Well, we know that in certain places, teachers are studying to get the vaccination. They are a high priority on the list. I will say that from teachers we've talked to, they're excited about the ability to get the vaccinations. In certain places, it's harder than others. We do not have numbers right now of how many teachers have taken and how many have not been able to take it. Just the only anecdotal that teachers are trying to do the best that they can to take the vaccination. And that is something that HSTA is encouraging.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, we're going to wrap everything up, and we thank you all for joining us today. And we want everybody listening to know that this news conference will be archived on HSTA's Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. And we thank you very much for being here. And Corey, do you have any final words?
No, just say to all the teachers that are paying attention, so thank you very much. We do appreciate all the work that our teachers are doing across the state. And we are optimistic that this will change the conversation and allow to make sure that we fund our schools properly and make sure that we give our keiki the schools they deserve. So thank you so very much.